Hello, it's Matthew here from the Nations of Sanity project, a project that's based on the assertion that crime and law can and should be defined by the concept of individual self-ownership and established as the terms of a peace agreement. And I'm sitting down today to have a conversation with DL Cummings, otherwise known as Liberty Dad, and I'll put a link to his YouTube channel, which I highly recommend people check out. I had a kind of debate with DL quite recently, about a week or two ago, on Jacob Winograd's podcast, Biblical Anarchy. And I kind of wanted to carry on the conversation with him, speak a little bit about Nations of Sanity, because I'm keen to get his scrutiny on that, and another sort of fledgling project that I've been thinking about, and just the whole kind of libertarianism, anarchism, the whole kind of subject. There's lots of things we can get into. So without further ado, I just want to hand over to DL, say thank you for taking the time again to speak with me, and perhaps introduce yourself to people who are listening as well.
Sure. So thank you for bringing me back on. So clearly I must have not been, too much of a pain in our previous discussion. One of the interesting things that I kind of started out with my own podcast was to say, you prepare for tomorrow's discussion by the one that you have today. So today now is tomorrow. And clearly the discussion that I had yesterday, quote unquote, if you will, a couple of weeks ago, that basically led to, I would like to have more conversation with this person. And that's generally what I try to aim for on my show, Liberty Dad. And it's more of modeling what I think we should do. And I try to think of it in terms of, I really talk about liberty a lot and freedom and how what that looks like, not only on an intellectual level, but just on a casual level. But then I'm also a dad. I'm a white collar worker, but I also like doing blue collar work. So I try to fit the mold of the dad that has some wisdom to offer the world, because at the same time of doing all of that, I want to raise dad voices because I feel passionate about fathers and fatherhood. And so my goal is to kind of do all of it at once. Let's talk about liberty. Let's talk about it in a nuanced, intelligent, wise way. And while we're doing that, let's demonstrate that men, fathers in particular, have something to offer the world, because I think that we've been given a bit of a bad shake over the last many years. And the way out of that is not to be argumentative about women, not to tear women down, but just simply to build ourselves up. So that's what I try to do.
Right, yeah, and I mean, I like the positivity of the work you do. Whenever I've watched any of your videos, I mean, I found them interesting, obviously, as you explain things, but yeah, there's not this kind of, I don't think I've ever seen you attack anybody or get kind of like, angry. It's always been a nice, calm,
I've had a few
measured.
moments.
I'm sure you have. We're all human. But yeah, and one of the reasons why I wanted to continue my conversation with you is because even though it was technically a debate, it was very
Mhm.
much more a kind of discussion
Mhm.
in the kind of spirit of it, as we were both really just having a conversation, and obviously we had issues where we might have a different perspective, but I feel like the conversation was very fruitful with regards to kind of illuminating our different
Right.
perspectives and getting a better understanding of where we're coming from. And that probably kind of segues quite well into the kind of things I want to speak about. And obviously our debate, quote unquote, was sort of generally about anarchism versus minarchism. You're a minarchist, I'm an
Mhm.
anarchist, and I kind of feel like we should have no government at all. And obviously, as a minarchist, you kind of do see some sort of value or need for a little bit. I know your position is quite nuanced, and you're not as anti-anarchist as many minarchists are. Right?
Right.
You don't seem to be against it in any kind of way. But one of the reasons why I was really keen to speak to you is because there's a lot of misconceptions about libertarianism in general, as I'm sure you'll agree, but in particular about anarchism, where I feel like I feel like a kind of bridge to minarchists, and even a bridge to just general statists and just normies, just regular people, is to kind of really cut through a lot of the misconceptions that people have about anarchism. And one of those is the idea that we have to lose any of the things that we associate with government when we lose government, at least
Mhm.
government as a ruling entity. And one of the things I really push with the Nations of Sanity project, and this idea of abolishing statism and not violating coercion by establishing this kind of law through a peace agreement idea, the kind of thinking behind it is saying, okay, well, if we do that one thing, and I know I spoke about this in our conversation, I likened it to abolishing slavery. Like, if you abolish slavery, then how the cotton industry adapts isn't something you need to micromanage. You just get rid of the coercion, and then the free market does the rest with regards to how this industry adapts. And I just feel like we can kind of do a similar thing with statism, whereas if we abolish that coercion and rightly recognize that as criminal in a formalized way, then we don't have to lose anything else. Like we don't have to throw the baby out with the bathwater, because we are only getting rid of that dirty bathwater. And our baby, if that can represent, say, our public infrastructure and our institutions and all of those things that are currently connected to government, once you sever that coercion, I just feel like people might realize that that approach allows them to keep the institutions they want to keep. Obviously, some will go, some will grow, some will shrink, some will disappear completely, but that will be dependent on the kind of free market principles of meritocracy. But the fact of the matter is they can still have all that. Like, one of the reasons why I don't call myself an anarcho-capitalist is, apart from the fact that capitalism, I feel, is like a bit of a broken word with regards to the fact that everyone has different definitions attached to it. But the other reason why is I don't like to alienate people who, for example, might have more communist ideals with regards to kind of, that kind of collective mentality, but are prepared to pursue those things within a voluntarist paradigm. You know what I mean? Like, I feel sometimes the left and the right and different, groups and ideologies, I think sometimes we kind of argue past each other a little bit, because there's the belief that you're going to stop me from pursuing this, or I'm going to stop you from pursuing that. When if we have this kind of voluntarist paradigm established, where we can say, well, the commies can pursue communism, they just don't get to force anybody else into it. The capitalists can pursue their free market capitalism, but they have to do it within the proper bounds of property rights. And you know what I mean? We're all playing by the same rules. It's equal rights in the truest sense. And I just feel like it's a different approach that doesn't necessarily have to replace all other approaches. Like I spoke before, I'm not 100% against incrementalism, in the sense that I'm not going to turn down positive steps in the positive direction. And I'm not going to, say no to people that are making work, or, and I encourage people that are trying to get us to evolve to kind of a libertarian society, rather than this kind of revolution idea that I'm trying to push. But even though I'm kind of supportive in all those ways, in the sense of saying, yeah, I clap them on when they're successful, kind of thing. I don't think it's the right approach. I think, like with slavery, we need to abolish statism. I think we need to kind of have a kind of revolution, not a violent one, but one where we make a fundamental change, not something that gradually changes. Not that I'm against the gradual change, but I just think that the giant step to a free society, in a way, is almost more achievable than the baby steps, which I feel too easily send us off in the wrong directions, and can be like a case of one step forward, two step back. Sorry, I gave you quite a lot there to address, but what's your thoughts on that?
So let's start with, I think, an area where we'll probably find a lot of agreement. And I think it is true that libertarianism, whatever it looks like, whether it looks like some level of minarchism that I would be happy with, some level that somebody else would, that maybe a little bit more, maybe a little bit less. I think you'd be hard pressed to find a little bit less with me, but let's just assume that's the case. Or whether it's anarchy, I think libertarians have done a very poor job of communicating that many of the things that we have in society, we might actually still have in some form of a libertarian society. So, for instance, just to give you the most recent example of something, right now there is a video going around. Two gay men, apparently, they got a daughter through surrogacy, and the baby's like 2 months old. I don't know. It's very, very young, very infant. And one guy's holding up the baby, and he's like, say daddy. And then the baby's like, mama. And he's like, no, there's no mama. And like, everybody's having an outrage, right? And they're like, oh, I can't believe this. This baby's crying for its mama. And I don't think we need to really dive into the science of whether or not the baby is just mimicking words that, or whether mama is harder to say, easier to say than dada or whatever. Like, if people are upset about that, what tends to be the case is that people say, well, we need to do something about that. And like there ought to be a law, right? That tends to be what people that are not libertarians will leap to. And I pointed out, I said, my wife and I, my wife is Catholic. I am exploring church, but I have no particular faith. But I attended a Reformed church this morning. So my wife is a devout Catholic, has been her whole life. So we went to an organization to adopt a child many years ago, before my son was born. And we were just going to check it out and see what the process was and just kind of get more information. So we're sitting in there with a bunch of other people, and they told I didn't realize it was a Christian organization. And so they said, we're a Christian organization. Cool. No issues there. And they said, in order to adopt through us, each parent that, we only adopt to married couples. Okay, cool. And they said, and each one of you has to have a letter from your pastor or your priest, verifying that you're an active member of the church, because they're like, we only adopt to Christian families. Okay. Well, I told my wife, I said, well, I'm not going to pass this because I have no pastor to get one from. So we left, right? I mean, and it wasn't like we left angrily. We didn't leave. I wasn't there was no indignation. We were just like, this isn't the place for us. And so I pointed that story out just so people realize, like, there are ways, like if you object to that, there are ways that you can sort of enforce that, or at least make these kind of instances far fewer than what they are, right? Where if it's the government that's facilitating this, well, the government cannot discriminate because the government is paid for by taxpayers, right? And so it's a very dangerous road if you say, well, okay, the government's gonna oversee this, and there's a moral issue here that that's not clear cut, like say murder or rape or something like that. Like those are pretty clear cut moral issues. But then you have other moral issues where people will debate that, and some people will say this is not appropriate, and other people say this is just fine, right? Well, in those particular cases, you definitely do not want government making the decision, because then that means they're going to have to they're going to have to play the more neutral person or entity. And so if you want to see less of that, then you should absolutely want to see that more on the free market, because it is the case, and it has been the case, that most of your companies, most of your organizations that are doing like adoption largely are Christian or some faith of some kind. There aren't very many secular ones. They exist, but there's very few of them for whatever reason. And so I think these kind of messages are what we kind of fail to tell people is like, yeah, maybe some of this stuff would actually still exist. I've told people, I'm like, in North Carolina, it's a state law that all restaurants have to display this little placard, and I think it's like once a quarter, once a month, or I don't know, some periodic. An inspector will come in and inspect the restaurant and then give them a rating. So they'll get like a 97, 98, whatever, and then they have to display that on the wall so that when you walk in, you can see, oh, these guys had a 92, and I don't really want to eat anywhere that's got less than a 95% rating or whatever, right? So that's all fun. That's all done through the state. And I pointed out, I'm like, that can all be done and could very likely be done in the free market, because competition might say, if you own a restaurant and I own a restaurant, competition might say, well, I want your customers and you want my customers. So I might say, hey, I'm going to reach out to this organization over here. They're going to come in and do an inspection. And then now I have a seal of approval for that inspection, right? And so that I can say, don't go to Matthew's restaurant because he doesn't have an inspection like I have, right? And then Matthew might go, okay, I'll go get an inspection too. And then he might say, I got a 97, DL only got a 95, right? And so then that's how we compete. And then that you can still get some of the things that people want to have, because the reality is, and I think this is another thing libertarians are notoriously bad about, they don't acknowledge that some of the things that our government does oversee, maybe who is overseeing it, we can argue and say that's not a good thing. But what they're overseeing is actually a good thing. It's actually a good thing to have a rating on a restaurant that says on an inspection, here's how you did. That's a good thing. It's a good thing to come in and say, hey, are you adhering to certain standards for cleanliness? Maybe even on a random check, whatever, right? Those are objectively good things to have. It's just really a question of who is going to do this? So I think starting off, that's going to be a point where you and I can certainly agree. Now, where we may kind of part ways in a sense is I will certainly prioritize certain things. So I might say, okay, well, the brain surgeon, I'm willing to let go for now. Let's talk about the hair braiding. Let's talk about the barber. You know, particularly those, and I think those are really great examples because those things have existed long before there was even any thought of we need government oversight to make sure, you know, you just went to the barber and either he knew how to cut your hair or he didn't, and he nicked you or he didn't, you know, and that was it, you know, and he probably got trained by an old barber himself, you know, and had to do whatever crazy things to demonstrate that he could cut somebody's, you know, hair without harming them, you know. So we've had a lot of these things, and I think that's one of the components that's missing with the libertarian community at large is that we don't communicate, hey, yes, you might actually still have a lot of the world that you see today in a libertarian society. It's just going to be run by different people, and there'll be some differences in incentives, which I think, in probably most, if not all cases, the incentives would actually create a more an increased value for some of these things, because if I'm using my placard for my rating to compete against your restaurant, well, then that placard means something a little bit more than I'm posting it because I'm just required to, right? Because now it becomes a selling point, one that I might actually incorporate into my ads. I might say, hey, don't go over to this guy. Then I'll show them. It'll almost be like the political ads, right? Don't vote for this guy. Look at how terrible he is. Vote for me. I'm the great person, right? It basically would look like that. So hopefully that answers your question and gets kind of the ball rolling. What's your response to all of that?
Yeah, well, I agree with a lot of that, if not all of it. And yeah, and it's a great point because and to be honest, just to demonstrate how much I agree with it, that is a big part of what I am trying to achieve. Whether I'm doing a good job of it or not is a different conversation, but that is something, a big part of what I'm trying to achieve with this idea of making the NAP the law and abolishing this coercion, because
Mhm,
it's really, again, I'm really trying to lead with that if
mhm,
we just do that, everything, it's like I often say, if we did it tonight, tomorrow you wake up, you've still got a regulated market, you've still got all of these infrastructure and institutions. The only difference is you now have the free choice whether you
mhm.
participate, and that free choice then applies the kind of, like I say, the principles of free market meritocracy then get applied to all these institutions that were currently running on coercion previously. And it's like with a regulated market, I mean, that's a perfect example of where we really need to cut through the misconception that the coercion that we want to get rid of also means that we want to get rid of regulation that is currently attached to that coercion. Like, for example, we would still have a regulated market tomorrow, and not only would that regulated market continue, but you may have competing regulating agencies. So you have like this, what was previously the centralized government in a free society, it would become part of this voluntary collective that the citizenry now have like an ownership over, as well as a free choice to have nothing to do with or continue.
Right.
And again, and that ownership puts the incentives in the proper place as well, because it's like, okay, well, the people that are participating have an investive interest in this because they have an ownership claim. It's a collective ownership, but it's still something that makes it worth like incentivizing them to kind of do right by. And then the people that don't want, like the idea that currently people pay taxes, most of which goes to things that we vehemently oppose, and the few things that do go to the things that we kind of want in some kind of way, even if we don't necessarily want them through government, are being so mismanaged because of all of the kind of corruption and bureaucracy and incompetence that just comes along with government as part of the package. So that's a very important point. But that's part of the point I try to kind of emphasize with the Nations of Sanity, and also with my kind of anarchism kind of message with regard, like, over the minarchism thing, because I feel like a lot of the things that, and I'm not speaking for you necessarily, although obviously I'd like to get your thoughts on this, but I feel like when I try to put myself in the mind of a minarchist, I feel like there's still a little bit of this remnant, but we need it for this, we need it for that. And I'm like, but we can still have this, that, and this and that without that coercion that I would say identifies the government side of it. I mean, in fact, I remember speaking to an objectivist once, and eventually we did get down to the point where we had an actual genuine disagreement. But a lot of our disagreement was really just about wording, because initially he was kind of like a minarchist. I think objectivists are kind of basically minarchists. But he was kind of making the point that he was happy to have a government that only enforced the Nappers law. He agreed that that was the only just law that we could kind of force on people. And the only kind of thing where we kind of stopped was the monopoly on force, with law enforcement. And that was one of the things I kind of wanted to lead with our debate. And I just feel like, well, that's just like the thing that all libertarians, including minarchists, want, say, statists or normies who aren't necessarily statists but just haven't thought about it. The thing that we want them all to consider is all the things that they currently associate with government. We want them to understand that they don't need a ruling coercive system. We can have roads without taxes, like we can pick the cotton without slavery. It's the same kind of thing. But one of the things that I feel like I even get kind of resistance with even with anarchists, and you saw it in our debate with some of the questions that came through from the anarchist audience, which was like, yeah, but law, the slavery was abolished through government though, and law is government. There's a kind of association there, and I'm like, well, hang on a minute. Law is not an exception to this we can have it without government thing. We can have it without this rule and coercion thing. And I feel like even many anarchists fall into the trap of thinking that that is kind of intrinsically attached to a ruling coercive government, to statism. And it's not. We can have law that's established as the terms of peace between equal parties. I mentioned in our conversation before international law as an obvious example of that. All right, that's a statist system, and it's between nation states that we don't recognize, but it's still law that's established between equal parties as terms of a formalized peace agreement, rather than dictates from a higher authority. Do you know what I mean? Like, our
Right.
domestic law is dictates from a higher authority, but international law is peace agreements between equal parties. There's no ruling authority. It's just, okay, but it's still a formalized law. And that's the kind of point I'm trying to push with this Nations of Sanity project, is saying it's almost like the one thing that, certainly I think obviously minarchists, but even many anarchists have kind of forgot this is the one thing that, even though they understand that there's all these other things we can have without government, they still seem to think that but we can't have law without government. You know what I mean? It's like,
Right.
and that's the kind of thing I really kind of want to push forward. And like the point that you made, I think really kind of connects nicely to that, because the idea that our poor messaging with regards to helping people understand that things like regulation can still exist. I mean, we have examples of it now. There are many regulating bodies that aren't coercive and must-haves, but businesses want to have them. I mean, I remember my stepdad was like a mechanic. He owned a garage, and his garage was part of this regulating body that was called the Good Garage Scheme. Totally voluntary, but it's a great selling point because customers trust him, because they know he's part of this other regulating body that demands certain standards, demands certain things, gives certain money back guarantees, and all those little extras that the non-aggression principles law wouldn't provide. All those little extras that people want with regulation, all the reasons why regulation is good, all the things, like I say, that's why I don't disagree with anything you said. I would just add the caveat to that none of that needs coercive authority. And not only does it not need it, but it's better off without it, both from not just from a moral point of view, but also from a how well it functions point of view.
I think what separates me from most minarchists, and it may be a slightly jarring to somebody who's first encountering me. A lot of minarchists, they fundamentally will say there is a point where there is government that's necessary. We, like the classic example is, we've got to have at least government for fire, rescue, hospital, basic emergency services, police, they might say that, right? I don't quite say that. I look at it, and I look at it from a different frame of context, rather than saying, what's the minimum that we need? Because I don't know that we can actually answer that. Even if we could agree there is some minimum of government, then it becomes how much and where. And that will be a never-ending conversation. This is why I kind of turned away and I said, you know what? I think it's better off to just look at government as something that you continually push back upon, because people are going to continually want some sort of oversight, some sort of regulation, some sort of punishment for doing this or that. And that's how government grows. So I looked and I said, okay, but people get carried away very frequently and just in their regular everyday, like we'll just put it like this didn't actually happen, but just making it up. Let's say that my wife and I have an argument. There's a good chance that one of us will get carried away. Not like, we're punching each other or something, but we might just get a little bit snippier than we otherwise would, right? You get a little bit carried away. So I think getting carried away is very natural human behavior. When you get it into government, when you're getting carried away with government, those are what we get. That's when we get all these new laws and regulations, right? People got carried away. Perhaps there was something meaningful, like, hey, you know what? Somebody gets arrested and they're exhibiting signs of mental health issues. Maybe we don't want them to be let loose until we can at least make an evaluation. So somebody says, well, we need a law to make sure that you cannot release that person, right? And then we don't need to litigate whether or not that's a good idea, but just some of those ideas, they're going to make a lot more sense to people. Some of them, they'll only make sense to a few people, but they still get passed anyway. So I think that's the distinction between me and many minarchists is that I look and I say, what is the lay of the land, and what do certain actions, where do they put me? Right. And I think that's where I start coming into some conflict with the anarchist, is because I feel like anarchists will look at, the body of regulation, the body of laws, and they will say all of it is illegitimate because government was illegitimate in the first place. And so therefore it makes it very difficult to compromise and say, even when there's a slight contradiction, oh, you're going to allow people to braid hair, but, not someone to work on your car without, some sort of license or something like that, right? And I look at it and I say, rather than look at it and say, where's the contradiction in my moral framework? I look at it and I say, where does this action place me? Does it place me in a way to leverage that action for future actions? Hey, if we get rid of the barbers and we just, the licenses for barbers, not the barbers, but if we get rid of licensing for barbers, then great. Now I have something to talk about and say, well, we should get rid of licenses for hairdressers too. Why, DL? Well, look what happened over with barbers. People weren't, getting anything more than a bad haircut, so that gives me leverage to work on something else. Because at the end of the day, I have to convince my fellow man, who is not even a libertarian in most cases, right? I have to convince them that it's a good idea. And I think this is where a lot of libertarians get it wrong, is, and including anarchists, and I think that might be where my beef is more. But if I'm honest, it's really all across the board. I try to think of it like I did when I was a Christian. If something is a good moral idea, I should be able to convince you that it is a good moral idea on the basis of, here's this idea, here's why it's bad, here's why you shouldn't do it, as opposed to just defaulting and saying, God doesn't want you to do it. Now, maybe you need that in some cases if you're, like you're being a little stubborn Christian or whatever. And so maybe in the context of religion, that's fine, because we've seen, if we study scripture, we see where that kind of was the case. But I think the problem is when we get to government, I think I think we are so far from anything that's just minarchist, let alone anarchist, that the idea of saying, well, all of government's bad, therefore this is also bad, I just don't think that's a palatable argument in the context of government. And so I need to be able to say, here is why this is not a good idea, or here's why it would be better over here, without even ever mentioning libertarianism, the non-aggression principle, with voluntarism, any of those buzzwords. In the same way that I might should be able to do it for Christianity or whatever religion that you might have, right? Get people to buy into the idea first, and then you can say, oh, by the way, this is a deeply held idea in the libertarian circles, or deeply held idea in our church, or whatever, right? And if you like that, there's more of where that came from. So I think those two things kind of hit both of what you were saying. Number one, I'm a little bit different minarchist than most, because I don't look at it in the context of there is a certain level of government for which I would say that's, we've gotten small enough, we don't need to go any smaller. Because I would look at it and say, give it a shot. See what happens if you go smaller. because I don't know. I don't know what would happen. I don't know what it would look like. I just know that if we got to this point, well, if we get to that point, you know, if we whatever point we get to, that's clearly a point that everybody was content with, more than likely. So give it a shot and go a little further. And see, and then if that doesn't work out, then maybe, okay, fine, we back up, right? Fine, I'm okay with that. But I'm not going to draw a line and say this is where we need to be. And then the other thing is just making sure that my argument, it does not rely on buzzwords and specific principles that have to be adopted and accepted first. I'd rather just say, doesn't this sound like a better idea to you? You know, and then, oh yeah, by the way, that's a libertarian idea. Surprise.
Yeah, I mean, well, I mean, as I say, and my thing is with the minarchist thing and agorists and like I say, and people that take the kind of evolutionary approach, I'm not against any of the positive steps that you make along the way. And one of the things I mentioned before we started speaking that I kind of wanted to talk to you obviously about the Nations of Sanity project, and I also wanted to talk to you about this kind of more fledgling idea of a project of trying to bring people, libertarians in particular, but just people in general, together with different ideas so we can kind of come together, scrutinize and all the rest of it. And also sometimes, even when we've got different ideas, I feel like, and I'm not saying, I'm not speaking for you on this point, but let's just imagine that I kind of like persuaded you sufficiently to the Nations of Sanity project idea that you were like, okay, yeah, that's a good idea. But I also still think what I think with regards to this incrementalist approach of, you know, thinking that's a kind of positive step. And it's like, well, I can walk and chew gum. Why not hedge my bets and support both things? You know what I mean? Like, why not support the direct step to a free society whilst also supporting the baby steps that I feel like are getting there? Because I don't fully know which one's going to work better or which one's going to have the more success or what's going to get us better results. And as I say, even though I don't personally adopt the incrementalist approach or the evolutionary approach or the agorist approach, because I've got this very specific different idea, like I say, I don't oppose them, and I would certainly support them in any areas where it's aligning with what I'm trying to do. You know, it's like if you came to me and said, Matt, hey, this is initiative we're trying to do to legalize cannabis in my state or whatever, will you support it in some kind of way? I'd be like, yeah, sure. The fact that I think that you should be doing, you know, getting rid of all drug laws entirely and not just legalizing cannabis on its own, doesn't change the fact that legalizing cannabis on its own is still a genuinely positive step in that direction. It's genuinely more liberty. It's genuinely less government. But as I say, I'm just personally motivated by the idea. And I suppose what I'm trying to do is not get everybody to abandon what they're currently doing. And that's what this bigger project idea is about. Because although it will include Nations of Sanity as one of the many ideas that would be interconnected, it's not, you could be part of this larger kind of connection and to completely reject Nations of Sanity and say, no, I just think these other ideas are better. And maybe your inclusion in this kind of network would be useful by the fact that you disagree with Nations of Sanity and you're a great source for scrutiny and pushback, and because you're not on board, and whenever I come and you can give me genuine reasons why you're not, which can help me kind of test it myself. You know, is he right about that flaw? Or if I think you're not right, but there's a perception, there's an improvement in message. You know, like I say, there's genuine value in us coming together and working together and talking to each other in a way where we really understand that we can help each other where we agree, we can help each other where we disagree, we can hedge our bets with regards to the path we're trying to take, what we think is the best path. And sorry, I've given you quite a lot to respond to there, but
no,
what's your kind of thoughts on that?
So let's talk about the Nations of Sanity and what it actually is, what it isn't. And, you know, since I'm not as familiar with it, you can present it and say, you know, here's what it is. Give me a summary of it. You know, here's what it's not. And then you can also, if you will, say, here are things that you might object to as somebody who's coming from a non-anarchist position, right? And then I think we can go from there and discuss the Nations of Sanity. Now, I will say I'm a little bit kind of taken back by the name, because I'm not sure that there's any nation that's sane. So just pointing that out, I think they're all a bit insane, and not by virtue of government, just by, or maybe that's what it is, you know, and I just don't want to acknowledge it. But I think that I think Nations of Sanity is almost asking for the impossible at this point with the way governments and the way countries are interacting with each other. So
It
a little
says
light
quite
humor there.
well, yeah, but it also, but the thing is, like, a lot of humor is rooted in truth, and I
Right.
think it says quite a lot that sanity is too high a bar. You know what I mean?
Right.
I mean, part of the when people ask me about, why I name it Nations of Sanity, because you're quite right, there are no nations of sanity, but that's what I want to change. You know what I mean? It's like I want to convert
Right.
all the insane, coercive nations into sane nations that have this objective law and terms of peace, not just within people to people, but
Mhm.
nation to nation and collective to collective and all of that. Yeah, I kind of get that idea, but that's part of the message behind the reason why I call it sanity is because I'm really kind of um perhaps trying to be a little bit provocative,
Mhm.
I'm trying to get attention, but there is a part I'm basically saying, look, this is bare bottom sanity. I'm not asking for us to all hold hands and sing kumbaya. I'm just
Right.
asking us to understand that rights is only coherent if it's based on individual self-ownership, and that
Mhm.
provides us an objective standard to define crime, just like understanding 2 + 2 = 4 allows us to work out all the other sums. That basic principle allows us to define what is and isn't a crime. Some stuff
Mhm.
is easy, rape, murder, theft, that's an equivalent to 4 + 4 or something nice and simple. Things like IP laws, abortion, that gets a little bit more complicated, but there's still a correct answer. It's just a little bit more, perhaps a little
Sure.
bit more calculation to do, but you still, because you've got this basic objective principle that neither of us has a higher right than the other. We both just have right over ourselves. Our property rights comes from that through first use
Mhm.
principles, and then voluntary trade and all that follows on from that. Crime and all, I always often say when I'm sort of talking about this idea, I say, we don't need a democratic majority to tell us that rape, theft, murder, assault, slavery are all crimes. We don't need a king, a queen, or anyone like that. These can all be objectively identified as crimes by the simple fact that if there is such a thing as rights, it can only be based on self-ownership. So it's incoherent to say you have the right to rape or enslave somebody or anything like that.
Mhm.
So there's a kind of moral truth that I feel that strikes at the heart of people. I feel like libertarians, we don't ignore that entirely, but I don't think we make there's not enough of that. You know what I mean? Like I think when I speak to regular people who aren't libertarian, have never even many of them haven't even heard the word libertarian. But when I talk to them about this idea, a lot of them are like, "Well, you mean the rule we all learned at play school?" And I mean, they all
Mhm.
kind of recognize it. Most of us live that way interpersonally already.
Right.
And I think a lot of our acceptance for things like taxation and government in general, just like people had an acceptance for slavery back in the days because it's all that had ever existed. I think similarly, I think a lot of people just accept taxation and stuff without even really thinking about the coercive elements so much because it's just all they've ever known. I mean, there's even that phrase which I find depressing, that it's even a phrase, but there's that phrase, death and taxes. The only two things that are certain in life are death and taxes. And
Mhm.
I'm like, seriously? All right, death, I understand, but taxes, that's the other most certain thing in the world, is that you're
Right.
going to get robbed by
Right.
this big criminal organization. So it's kind of, but that demonstrates how ingrained it is into us. Like for as
Mhm.
long as history, even like you mentioned the Bible, even the nativity story is they had to register for taxes to go to Bethlehem.
Right.
You know what I mean? And I remember even as a kid thinking, why did they have to do that? Who was making them
Right.
do that? You know what I mean? Who had the right to say you've got to sign this bit of thing? You know what I mean? So sorry, I feel like I'm on a bit of a tangent there. I kind of lost my thread,
No, no,
but
I think it's good. And it's interesting when I think there might be two elements to, and I try to keep everything as simple as possible. I try not to get too complicated. I think that's another way to kind of lose an audience is to make it complicated, right? And so I try to keep everything super complicated. But I will say, I think there may be, because you mentioned like, um, oh, what was the example you just gave a second ago? I'm drawing a blank on it. But you were talking and you're like, hey, um, slavery. Like a lot of people accepted slavery because that's the way that we've always done it, and that certainly is one reason why people will accept certain rules and regulations or laws or what have you. But I think another reason is that people believe that whatever harm they do is compensated for by the positive that they do. So if you say, hey, we have something in the United States, you may be familiar with it, called WIC, Women, Infant, Children. Basically, a single mom can go and basically get welfare, and it's basically like food stamps, right? It's a way to help, a struggling mom make sure that her and her babies are fed, right? That's a good thing to make sure. If we just leave the step away from government doing it, that's a good thing in society, to have a mechanism that doesn't allow single moms who are struggling for them or their babies to starve. Having some system of what, that's a good thing in itself. And so I think a lot of people go, well, okay, you're taking tax money away from me, and maybe Matt doesn't want it taken at all because he would just rather give it to his favorite charity, right? Or build his own charity or whatever. And maybe DL is okay with some, but just you're taking too much, right? But I think people will look at it and go, in either case, they'll say, yeah, but this person has nothing, you have something. We got to make sure that we take care of them, right? And so they basically are using the good that's coming out of it, an objectively good thing, and using that to outweigh the negative part, right? And so I think it's worthwhile to kind of distinguish between those two things. Some were, slavery had no objective good. I mean, perhaps maybe during the times people thought otherwise. But the truth is, there's never an objective good of forcing somebody to do labor for you. Perhaps for you, maybe, but not for them, right? And so I think these are the kind of conversations that we as libertarians, we as people that want some level of smaller or no government, these are the kind of conversations that we have to get used to having. We have to start saying, okay, let's have a practical conversation. Let's not lead with, but my principle says, right? Let's talk about the idea in itself. And is it even a good idea? Some ideas are just, I think, are very clearly not a good idea, period, in any form, right? And we can certainly argue against those and say it was never a good idea. Slavery was never a good idea. There is no situation under which slavery, forced labor for somebody else, is acceptable, right? And but then we can take some other things and say, well, okay, I see what you're trying to do here. I see you're trying to make sure that mothers and children don't starve, and that's a good thing, right? And a lot of people get that from their Bibles, right? The Bible will say, I know I'm using a lot of Bible references, but it's Sunday, so whatever. But the Bible does say that, take care of your widows and your poor and stuff like that, and that is a good thing in a society for us to do. And so I think the conversation needs to be a little bit more empathetic, even if at the end of the day, we turn around and say, look, I empathize with this issue, but that's not the answer. It is a bad answer, and I just cannot, I cannot support this, period, right? But I think we have to lead with empathy. And it doesn't have to be the whole weaponized empathy that everybody's talking about. Just, it's what they say, what's that saying? People don't care what you know until they know that you care. Right. And that's a pretty serious truism that we have, at least in the United States. I assume it probably is, is probably equally as powerful over where you are, across the pond there. So I think that's part of the conversation that we need to have, because honestly, I feel like most of our conversation, really not ours, like me and you, but most of our conversation in the liberty community is really about, what is the principled thing to do? Principle, principle, principle. And I'm like, okay, if you have your principles, now learn to talk about them in a way that's appealing. And it's not because honestly, when the way that I feel is a lot of, and this goes for minarchists as well, a lot of people will present their principles at the forefront, and it really doesn't sound any different than someone saying the law is the law. It just sounds basically the same way. The law is the law. The principle is the principle. I'm sorry. And it doesn't seem to be empathy. Does that resonate with you? I know that was a lot. I guess we're both just doing spewing a whole lot and then passing the ball.
I understand exactly what you're saying. And I mean, just to I wrote it down because I didn't want to forget it when you were talking, but when you said about, like, obviously slavery wasn't a good thing, but there's a lot of things that we're doing, under the coercive system, that if you forget the coercive part of it, on their own are genuinely good things, and most people would agree they are. But one of the things I wanted to sort of say, which is why I wrote it down because I didn't want to interrupt you, but when you said about, like, obviously slavery wasn't a good thing, I was like, yeah, but picking cotton was. And one of the
Right.
things that I want to cut through is to say we can keep on picking cotton without slavery. We can keep on providing welfare for women and children without the coercive system. And so I mean, I am perhaps guilty of it a little bit, with regards to the leading with the principle, because it is my first kind of thought. But I do like to follow it up with some pragmatic arguments as well. Like, when I'm debating what I lovingly call bordertarians, libertarians who are on the wrong side of immigration, in my opinion. And I've offered to debate people like Dave Smith on this subject. And one of the things I do is I kind of lead with the principle, you don't have a right to stop people going places you don't own. That's the kind of immigration debate over, from my point of view, on a principle point of view. But I also don't ignore that there is genuine immigration problems. And I like to then also say, but also, even if you don't care about the principle, there's actually libertarian solutions that are consistent with this principle that are also the pragmatic winners as well. To the point, and I basically say, like with immigration, I say, look, you don't need to spend, government caused the immigration problems, and government is not the solution to the immigration problems.
Sure.
Spending more of our money on policing something that they're causing, it's an insanity to me. And so apart from the principle side of it, I'm saying, well, look, we have more effective libertarian solutions with regards to welfare reform and law reform, because, like, it's not organic, free market driven immigration that's the problem. That's not what's causing the mass immigration that's getting everybody up in arms. It's the subsidizing of that immigration through our government that people are being forced to pay for. And one of the things that frustrates me with the Dave Smiths of this world is they are, not only are they standing on the wrong side of this, but they're missing an opportunity to take advantage of a crisis, in the sense of showing, okay, well, look what's caused this, and look how we can fix it. Not by asking the government to do more, but getting the government out of the way. Stop the subsidizations, reform our welfare. It's easier to build walls around welfare systems than it is around an entire country. Like, kind of, leading with that kind of attitude. And the reason why I do that is because, even though I do, obviously, the principle is, the central part of what I'm fighting for, but I also want to lead with the fact that this actually has a real pragmatic strength as well. It's not an either or. It's not, we don't have to make the choice. I often feel that people on the, what I call the bordertarian side of the immigration argument, they kind of straw man our side of it a little bit, saying, oh, you just want immigrants coming over here and doing this and doing that. So no, we don't want that. We want, immigration to be an organic thing where, people come over here if they genuinely can support themselves. Then why is that a problem? If they're peaceful people who aren't violating property rights, and if they're coming over here on their own steam because they're contributing to the economy in a way that they're self-sufficient, then what's the problem with that? The problem isn't with that. The problem is, as I say, with the subsidized immigration that completely messes up with it. So a little bit like your incrementalist approach, where you kind of show, well, look, if we can take this step closer to free market, away from government and towards free market, although I think that is also something that would apply nicely with the immigration argument. You could take that approach and almost make the same arguments as I'm making, but with that more incrementalist thing, rather than saying, let's abolish the welfare state, you're saying, well, let's just reform it so that it's not so easily abused, and it's not becoming a way to attract the rest of the world in, and all that sort of stuff. But the reason why I wanted to kind of highlight the pragmatic strength of this is not because I want to boast that I had the same opinion as a white nationalist, but the immigration solutions that I was promoting as the libertarian solutions of saying, well, let's just stop the subsidy, let's just reform our law system, was the exact same argument I saw, obviously on Twitter, For some reason, I see white nationalist stuff now and then on Twitter. I don't know if you do too.
Sometimes.
Yeah. But one of the things that it amazed me, I knew this guy because I'd heard him post other things before, and I think other stuff in his post, alluded to his other opinions. But the fact of the matter is he was making the same point as me. He's like, you don't need to deport them, you don't need to build walls, you don't need to stop boats, just stop subsidizing, and they'll deport themselves. The ones that,
Right.
and he was doing that without any loyalty to libertarian principles whatsoever. He was a white nationalist. He doesn't have any moral qualms about using the government to be violent towards peaceful immigrants, but
Right.
he just made a purely pragmatic decision that it was just genuinely a more effective solution to stop the subsidies than it was to ask the same ridiculous government that caused the problem to try to fix the problem with more violence at the expense of more taxpayer money,
Right.
etc., etc. So, sorry, that's a long-winded way of basically making the point that the principled approach and the pragmatic approach don't have to be mutually exclusive. And even though I do definitely lead with the principle, because I feel like there's a value to sticking to that for even pragmatic purposes, but even the solutions themselves, I think we're not doing enough work. Like the immigration debate's a perfect example of that. Not enough people, even on my side of the debate, are making that pragmatic point, saying not
Right.
only do we oppose government deportations and violations, it's not just because ICE are doing it in a terrible way and all the rest of it, and all these other sort of violations that go along with it, which, to give someone like Dave Smith credit, he has at least called that out, even if he still supports the kind of policies that led to it a little bit. But that's my point. It's like, so I kind of agree with you with regards to where the libertarian messaging has failed, but I'm kind of piggybacking that point onto my kind of own argument by saying one of the ways we cut through that is to kind of really emphasize the fact that the principle often is the principled solution often is the pragmatic solution as well. And I think that like I say, I agree with you that I think we need to do more work to deal with the pragmatic side of it. Like, okay, well, how are we going to feed the women and the children if we don't have a coercive system that's forcing people to do it? And the point I would make in that kind of example is to say, well, if you wake up tomorrow and you now have a choice, not only about what you pay taxes towards, but whether you even pay taxes at all, I can assure you, I have no doubt in my mind that the organizations that are feeding women and children will not only continue to be funded, but will probably get an increase of revenue. And
Right.
a lot of organizations within the government would just disappear entirely because no one would willingly give a penny towards them. You know what I mean? If anything,
Right.
many people would donate to have them eradicated. You know what I mean? So this is the kind of point I lead with when I'm speaking to left wingers and socialists. I say, look, you can have your socialism, which I would call like some kind of collectivism that's non-coercive. If I want to, so that voluntary socialism isn't an oxymoron, I've got to apply a definition to socialism that includes obviously voluntary versions. But if you can kind of get the spirit of what I'm saying, I basically point out to them all the things that they say they want, all like the welfare programs and all that. I say, well, look, all those welfare programs would work much better if you took the coercion out of it, because the coercion just makes it corrupt, makes it like a big bureaucratic incompetent mess, and most of the money that you want to go there is going other places. Whereas in a
Right.
voluntary system, the things that we worry about, and that's one of the things I really lead with this idea. I even have a video called "The Baby in the Bathwater," and I make the point about things like we have an NHS over here in England, like a national health system. Not only do I not think that would disappear, I think that's more likely to disappear under our status system because it's so corrupt and mismanaged, and even people that support it are kind of getting sick of doing so.
Right.
I think it's in more danger of crumbling under our status system because people might end up voting it out, and there's certain governments that want to privatize it and all the rest of it. Whereas under a voluntary system where people have got this ownership and this choice that then applies the free market principles of meritocracy that would then basically wash away the corruption. Because that's the thing, I don't want it to sound kind of too simple-minded, but one of the kind of selling points I lead with this idea of abolishing statism and doing this one simple thing is that one simple thing has an effect, like an implication that does wash away the corruption out of institutions, because you're no longer forced to pay for your, like, say your local police service is corrupt. Okay, you don't have to pay for them, and you can now pay for a law enforcement service that's not corrupt. Do you know what I mean? And not only
Right.
that, and in a truly free society, not only will that law enforcement provide a better service, but they might even end up arresting the other law enforcement services if what they're doing is actually committing crimes. The problem that we have today is there's no accountability. Your own government violates your own constitution on a regular, overt basis because there's
Sure do.
nobody to hold them account. So even when you've got clearly written rules,
Mm-hmm.
because they've got this monopoly in force that no one can come and police what they're doing, there's no accountability. And one of the things I emphasize with the idea of making the non-aggression principle the law, because a lot of people kind of think, well, who's in charge? Who's kind of setting that? And it's like, okay, well, like the US has a constitution, it would just be this principle that's kind of setting it. But with regards to who's making sure it's being followed properly, the best way to do that is to not have one coercive organization that has a monopoly on force that can then just be corrupt and no one can do anything about it, but to have this system where everybody has equal right to police everybody else.
Mm-hmm.
Kangaroo courts will just become criminalized by real courts and real law enforcement if they're trying to kidnap people under spurious charges and put them through some kind of kangaroo trial. A real law enforcement can come over and not only free those people but prosecute. There's no one to prosecute the bad cops. There's no one
Mm-hmm.
to arrest the bad cops. They have qualified immunity and all other kinds of things that just protect them. These are things that just wouldn't happen in a free society. So, sorry, I went on a bit there, but one of the points I'm basically kind of, to sum it all up, is to basically say that not only, and it is linked to the point that you made, that not only can we have these things without this coercive government, but these things would actually be better without these
Right.
things. And a lot of people fear that we're going to lose them. And I say, no, they would be better with them. Sorry.
Yeah. So I think I go back to this idea. So I kind of follow this notion of meet people where they are, right? And then I had a friend one time, and I've always struggled with this, but he said, sometimes you need to work on making somebody believe the idea is their idea, right? Rather than me trying to say, I have this great idea, here's why you should adopt it. More like, hey, have you considered this? And then they think of like, oh, you know what, we should do this. And it's like, now they think it was their idea in a sense, and they're more willing to maybe put in the effort to shift gears from where they are to where they're, where they've been. I'm sorry, where they, where I might want them to be. So this morning, right after church, it was interesting. I was talking to a guy, and he's followed my podcast, and we were talking, and I don't remember how we got there, but we were talking about spanking, and I pointed out, I said, it's a very touchy subject in the Libertarian Party or the Libertarian community, because a lot of libertarians, because we believe in the non-aggression principle, we believe that hitting anybody that's not in self-defense is completely wrong, which means, no spanking your kids when they did something bad because you were not under threat. And I said, so that makes it a very touchy subject. And I said, however, it has challenges because spanking them because maybe they threw their sister's toy away, that's far different than going up and assaulting somebody, right? There's a clear difference between the two. So what I told him, I said, one of the ways that I ask people this, I say, I try to evaluate what outcome are you looking for, right? I start there. When people that spank their kids, when we can tie immigration similarly along this line, when people spank their kids, the reason that most people spank them is because they want their kids to grow up to be good people that don't hurt people and don't steal their stuff. Maybe not quite in the libertarian sense, but that's generally what they want. They don't want their kid to grow up and be bratty and feel entitled to everything. They want a decent human being. And so if that means they need to spank them to get there, then that's what they'll do. So their goal is admirable, right? And we can argue and say, yeah, the path that you're taking is not. So rather than try to frame it as abuse, or you might say coercion, what I try to say is, okay, if you can get the same result without spanking your child, would you? Like, nobody's going to say, no, I still want to spank my kid, right? They're all going to be like, well, yeah, because what I'm appealing to is the outcome that they want. And so I'm just getting rid of all of my language, all of my rationale. And I'm just saying, okay, you want a kid that's going to grow up, get good grades, get married, have more kids, give you some grandbabies, and have a good job and be functional in society, not commit any crimes. Totally wonderful. I love that. That's great. Now, let's talk about if you actually have to spank a kid in order to get that, right? And we challenge the notion that you cannot have this outcome unless you use this level of force. Same thing with immigration, right? Like, okay, let's say that we don't want Tren de Aragua to come over here, the very nasty Venezuelan gangs, right? And I've got some friends from Venezuela, and they're not libertarian, but they will tell you, they will say straight out, Tren de Aragua is so bad, they said the only option is to kill them, right? Because they're just a vicious gang, and that's their perspective. And I'm like, okay, well, I'm going to trust your perspective because I don't really know them, right? They sound about as bad as MS-13. And so but in the context of immigration, if there was a way to remove violent criminals, right, or not have them in the first place, that didn't require the ridiculous complexity and problems that we have with the immigration system, if there was a way to have only people coming over here that want to contribute, should we not have that, right? Should we not seek that out? Most people would probably be like, yeah. And then I'm more of an Ellis Island kind of guy, so I'm very limited in saying, like, look, I would deny entry to somebody who has documented violent crime or a serious communicable disease, at least temporarily. Okay, those are my two criteria. I'm very simple on that. And then as to the answer of, okay, well, what about, because people say, well, what about our welfare system? Okay, well, do you agree with welfare? Most people will say no, or on a very limited basis. Okay, well, shouldn't we tackle that first, right? And then, then that's the big argument right now with immigration is like, hey, as long as these immigrants are coming over, they're going to get all this tax money or whatever. Maybe they are, maybe they're not. Let's just assume they are. That's fine. Okay, they're going to get all this tax money. Well, like what you said, maybe we should address the actual problem here. The actual problem is that we're giving a bunch of people money that we shouldn't be giving money to for whatever reason, right? Even if we accept we're only going to give this to women and children who are struggling, okay? Well, that's clearly not what's happening. It's being given to a whole lot more. So, and the reason, and the thing that I point out is rather than talk about, coercion and all the what I call buzzwords, the libertarian buzzwords, I would just simply say, if you remove all the immigrants, you still have this broken system. You still have this system that exists. And so therefore you still have Americans that are on it, and you still have a possibility that the Democrats will elect a leader in the future and they'll let more people in like Biden allegedly did. Okay, fine. So we haven't really removed the source of the problem. So now we have to do the immigration enforcement. And then after that, now that we're all tired from doing that, now we got to go and fight yet another battle. And so I look at it kind of in a similar way. And I say, rather than, again, I'm trying to appeal to people where they are. And so I say, wouldn't you like a welfare system that was lean and mean, right? Maybe not mean, but lean, right? And most people would say, yeah, I would. Like even if we really don't want a system like that at all, most people in America, most non-libertarians would say it should only serve the absolute needy. Okay, great. And do you think that immigrants coming over here for the first time are the person that should be on it? And they'll say no. Okay, great. Why don't we deal with the welfare system? Because by dealing with the welfare system, it is a 2-for-1 deal. We not only deal with the welfare system itself, but then we don't have to have this additional fight about immigration. So it's basically winning through attrition. And so I think this is the thing that I like to focus on, which is meeting people where they are and finding the simplest answer that gets the results that we're all looking for, right? And so when I'm talking to them, I kind of reminded of Patrick Bet-David recently. So a guy on his show, Adam something or other, went and debated Dave on Piers Morgan. Adam did very, very terribly. It was all over. People made fun of him and all that. And Patrick Bet-David asked, they were doing kind of like this follow-up, and he was talking to Adam, and he said, what is the purpose of a debate? And Adam gave his answer, and then, Patrick Bet David had a different answer. He said, the purpose of the debate is to get the person to say, that's a good point. Or, oh, yeah, that's, it is basically to get a light to go off. And so when I talk to people, I'm trying to meet them where they are, and I'm just trying to get a light to go off. Hey, you know what? I realize that you don't want all these immigrants for whatever reason. Maybe I agree with you, maybe I don't, whatever the case is. Is that really the best way to get what you're looking for? And if you don't really want a bunch of immigrants coming, because most people don't want immigrants coming over here sucking up welfare benefits, right? Okay, great. I agree with that. I actually don't want anybody taking welfare. So why don't we tackle the welfare and put in that fight? Because is it really going to happen that we're going to have a big, huge fight in America on immigration? And then if we win, then we'll have the energy and the wherewithal to go and have the next big fight to deal with the original problem. So in that particular case, you can see I'm framing this not as a libertarian issue, not as a principle issue, only like, okay, I see the outcome you're looking for. Perhaps the idea that you have isn't going to give it to you anyway.
Yeah,
Because I want to create a seed of doubt in the path that they have chosen. And I want them to feel a light bulb go off in a path that I have chosen. But I have to, so I really work hard on my show to kind of talk about these things without using any of the language or talk about principles. And it's not that they're wrong or bad. Like they're either there in your argument or they're not. You can, if somebody were to say, well, where's the principles? I could say they're right here. Right. How does that sound to you?
well, I mean, I very strongly agree with a lot of what you said because, I mean, just to go back to the immigration point, that's another point I make that you made as well, with regards to the fact that not only are these libertarian solutions a more effective solution to the immigration problem, reforming welfare, reforming our law system, but these are things that we desperately need to do regardless of immigration. You know what I mean? So, I mean, yeah, that's a great point, and that is a point that I've made myself when I'm kind of laying out my arguments. And although, like I say, I will hold my hands up, but I don't even necessarily think it's wrong to do. I do lead with the principle, but I do understand that it is also important to follow it up with. And the reason why I like to always point it back to the principle because I like to show the common thread that's running through all these solutions. I like to show that all these solutions are essentially the same solution when you take it back to its root, so that's one of the reasons why I do still like to really
But
emphasize
is that necessary?
well, I do think it is, even if it's only for that purpose, even if it's only for that larger picture of showing them how this principle keeps popping up as the common thread. Like, look, here's even if I took your approach, like say for example, I take the approach. I mean, in a sense, what you just said about the immigration arguments is, and the arguments I make, we're almost making the same arguments, but with slightly different drivers. You're giving it that kind of meeting them where they are, showing them that there's this kind of, well, don't you think that would be better here kind of thing. Whereas I'm kind of leading with the principle, it's wrong, slavery's wrong regardless of how we pick the cotton, but then leading with the but we can pick cotton this way kind of thing. Whereas you're kind of saying, well, we can pick cotton this way without even mentioning the principle side of it element. And I suppose what I'm kind of saying is well, in a way, we could both have present this exact same solution, and I'm leading with the principle but following it up with the pragmatic, if you like, and you're leading with the pragmatic, but perhaps you could still follow it up with the principle. So you know what I mean? So we're both doing the same thing. We're both giving them both, and that's what I do when I do the immigration argument. I give them the principle and I give them the pragmatic. I don't just give them one or the other because I feel that both are important elements. The principle, because I feel like that's something you can always fall back on to show the consistency of what you're representing.
Right.
But on its own, it just sounds like purity, virtue signaling, and all the rest of it. If you're ignoring all the pragmatic implications, but by leading, so the arguments that you're leaning with, I do think are important. And even though I don't necessarily lead with them, I do follow up pretty closely behind what I do lead with. I still lead with my principle, but I do follow straight up with exactly the points you made, which is the libertarian solutions are actually pragmatically better. And not only are they pragmatically a better solution for immigration, but even if immigration was not an issue, and like you say, we solve that like that, we still have the welfare problem. We
Right.
still have the law, so these are, I mean, and that's why I feel like that's why my frustration with people like Dave Smith is I feel like there's a missed opportunity for these more prominent libertarians, because they could really point to immigration is kind of the canary in the coal mine over welfare. You know what I mean? The reason why people are panicking over the immigration system is and even a lot of bordertarians will come and say, particularly those that are obviously claiming to be anarchists or libertarians whilst holding this kind of anti-immigration policy, their justification often is to say, well, look, we can have open borders or a welfare state, but not both. That's their kind of, and then and Jacob mentioned in our debate, well, what about the order of doing things? And I mean, that kind of tied nicely back to my idea of saying, well, if we have a blanket abolished, then the order is it's all happening at the same time, so that kind of solves that issue. But the other point I like to make is okay, well, yes, even if you take that pragmatic approach and forget the principle entirely, like my example of the white nationalist who was literally promoting libertarian ideas without any care of libertarian principles, just because he, as a white nationalist of all people, saw it as the most pragmatic approach to deal with the immigration that he disliked for various other reasons. And he had no principal objection to using state violence. He just realized that just from a purely pragmatic point of view, these libertarian solutions that he's got no loyalty to whatsoever are actually the more effective solution. So to cut a long story short, I basically am saying I agree with you about the importance of the pragmatic argument, but only with the caveat that I still think the principle needs to at least be standing next to the pragmatic argument. I still lead with it. I still put it slightly above it. But I do agree that it's important enough that I feel like you need to at least follow directly. And I would perhaps suggest to you, not even to persuade you to do what I'm doing of leading with the principle and following the pragmatic, but lead with the pragmatic by all means, but perhaps follow with the principle. Because what does it hurt once you've open that door with the pragmatic argument to also mention, and by the way, this is all consistent with this particular principle that may also allude to other solutions in other areas,
Yeah, I think what I see here, and you can tell me if when I explain this, if you see it similarly. So are you familiar with Dave Ramsey? He's a big money guy, and he teaches people how to be financially responsible. And so like one of his big things is he's like, you should never have a credit card, because credit card basically is just going to get you in trouble. He's like, millionaires do not become millionaires because they got points from their credit cards. Right. And like, he's like, stop using credit cards. Now, I don't entirely agree with him on his position, because many, many successful people have a credit card that they use very, very wisely. Our family is one of them. We pay our bill on a regular basis. We don't overextend ourselves, and we enjoy some of the bonuses that we get from the points and the miles and what have you, right? But where I think he's got a value add is that most people are not capable of managing a credit card properly. They may go into it thinking, oh, this one's going to give me a lot of points, but then they just overextend themselves. They spend too much. They spend more money than they have to pay the bill, and then they run themselves into trouble, and it just goes downhill from there. So I think this is kind of akin to maybe you and I. I think it sounds like, because I haven't seen your arguments with other people that much, but it sounds like perhaps you are able to wield the idea of principles in a way where it's not destructive, like a credit card, right? Whereas what I've observed is many others do not seem to be capable of doing that. So what I see tends to be more of a focus on the principles, and then focus more on the principles, and then focus more on the principles. And then maybe if you get around to it, you offer a pragmatic idea that people can go, wow, that's a really good point. I never thought of it that way. So I guess I'm kind of doing the Dave Ramsey thing, where I'm like, look, it's not like, unlike Dave, I'm not saying that, unlike Dave Ramsey, I'm not saying that principles are bad, where he says credit cards are bad. And I don't know if he believes it, how much he believes it or not. I know that he does not take credit card when you try to buy some of his programs and subscriptions and things. So he's at least honest in that sense. But I treat it in a similar manner. I look and I say, I'm not leading with the idea of principles, and I rarely mention it, because I think that what ends up happening is people get too focused on the principle and a lot less focused on the pragmatic idea. Because at the end of the day, anybody that you're going to convince based purely on the principle probably is already there. So you're probably not really convincing them. You're just reiterating to them, right? The people that I need to convince are the people for which the principle is not going to be good enough. So I have to meet them where they are. I have to demonstrate that. So that's the focus that I take. And then I also communicate that out to libertarian community. I say, stop talking about your principle. If your principle is your principle, great. That's awesome. I love it. Now figure out, how do you convince somebody that your idea, whatever it is the better idea? And I think that one way to do that is to meet people where they are and then hear them out and say, all right, what are you trying to accomplish here? Because if somebody just says, I want a white nation, right? If somebody says that, and then they say, and I don't care what it takes to get that. And if that's their actual goal, I mean, I got a different conversation to have with them. We can't talk about the immigration system because the idea that they have, I don't even think is tenable in the first place. So now we got to have a different conversation or no conversation, right? So the first thing I need to figure out is, what are they trying to accomplish? Then if I can accept what they're trying to accomplish, then I want to show them, okay, here is how my view complements, maybe even provides you what you're looking for, right? And I think this is where you and I just may have our biggest disagreement, but I may, over time, after observing you and seeing how you do communicate, I may find that you are not the typical anarchist that I run into who seems to only be able to talk about principles, who doesn't have a lot of pragmatic ideas, that doesn't say, here is how your worst fear in my utopia isn't really something to be fearful of at all. Right. And that is probably the biggest frustration that I have with anarchists. And that's one of the reasons why when I first became a libertarian, I was like, all right, I don't want to talk to you people because you people are insane, because it was just like principle. And they would say things like, well, DL, you're just not principled, or that's statism. And I'm like, well, I am a minarchist, so that was kind of part of the deal, right? At some point, I was going to accept something. It's like, so it's not a dunk. It's not a point that you can win on. So, but do you see where I'm coming from with that?
Yeah, no, 100%. And I mean, I recognize it, at least to the degree that, like, for example, my approach to my conversation with you has been more, or at least I've tried to make it more than just me saying the principal argument, but also saying, well, look, a lot of the things that you might value, the reasons why you are a minarchist, because you see the value in this and the value in that. I'm leading with I'm also sort of saying, I think that you can have those things. It's not just the fact that so no, I agree with that. And to be honest, it's like, for example, if I was to have a debate, I mean, I remember listening to Dave Smith once say, when he was defending his position on immigration, he insisted that it was consistent with the principles of libertarianism, which
I disagree with him, by the way, just for the record.
Yeah, well, I do know that, actually, but I mean, and people do sigh a little bit because he calls himself an anarchist, an ANCAP, and there are minarchists who can see that his position is really quite statist, so that's a kind of frustration. But one of the things I remember him saying was, even though he insisted that he had the libertarian position, and he pointed to people like Hoppe, who he felt gave him that kind of credibility, saying, no, this is a libertarian position, but one of the things I remember him saying was, well, if it isn't, if it means that I've got and then he kind of gave some real extreme example of have immigrants sleeping in my front yard or some it was a bit of a straw man, but he's kind of dismissive towards the open border side of things. But the fact that he said, if it wasn't libertarian principles, I just wouldn't be a libertarian. Like, he's like saying, I think my position is the libertarian position, but if someone told me it wasn't and I had to be an open borders to be a consistent libertarian, then I would just say, okay, I'm not a libertarian. Now, if I was to have the immigration debate with Dave, if I only won on the principal argument, in the sense that I was able to convince him that he was wrong on the principle, all I've achieved, according to his declaration, is that he wouldn't be a libertarian anymore. You know what I mean? Whereas if I coupled that argument, which I still think is important, because I think he needs correcting and to get his principles right, but but I know that I need to couple that. If all I ever achieved was that, all I would do is lose him as a libertarian. But if I coupled that with the pragmatic arguments and showed him that he doesn't have to have this nightmare scenario and just accept it, he can avoid that with more effective libertarian solutions that don't betray principles and all of that, then I'm not saying I'd achieve either of these goals, but my point is if he was to win over the pragmatic and the principled argument, then I would have converted a very prominent libertarian to now promoting a better message, you know. Whereas if I only convinced him on the principle, according to his declaration of saying, well, if I was convinced that it's not the principled libertarian thing, I just wouldn't be a libertarian because that's how strongly I, feel this way. But because that opinion seemed to be based on all these things that he basically felt like Bordertarians were doing what you're saying, where they're just saying the principle part and then not giving, basically holding their hand up and saying, we don't care about all these implications you're talking about. We don't care about the welfare system because that doesn't justify more state violence. And even though I agree with the principle of the argument, the welfare system doesn't justify more state violence through immigration. Right. But we shouldn't ignore the fact that that is an externality. And if we point out that we have libertarian solutions to deal with those externalities, like you alluded to with the welfare state, not only is that a solution to immigration, but that's a solution that we desperately need regardless of immigration. Even, even if we accepted the Bordertarians' immigration control and deportations and all that, let's imagine that was actually an effective solution for immigration, which I don't think it is, even if I forgot all my libertarian principles and was only dealing with the pragmatic side. But let's imagine, for argument's sake, that it was. And then let's take our libertarian solution that's an alternative. Let's say they both solve the immigration problem, but one only would solve the immigration problem, God knows what other expenses, but the other one would solve the immigration problem and also the domestic problems we have with welfare. You know what I mean? And so, and I cut a long story short, because sorry, I've gone on a bit there. But my point is I do recognize the value in the pragmatic side of it and the truth in what you're saying. And the only thing I would add to that is I just don't think it needs to be either or. I think the principle, I still think it's slightly more important. So I still lead with it myself. But I do agree with you that the pragmatic argument is important enough that, like I say, if I was to have a debate with someone like Dave Smith, I wouldn't just settle on the principle argument. I would follow it up with the pragmatic and say, look, you're wrong on the principle, but also you're wrong on the pragmatic. This is actually a better way to avoid the nightmares that you think the open border anarchists, and many of them would, because they do ignore the pragmatic side.
Right.
So I think there's value in what you say.
And I think there's a huge value, whether you're talking to a libertarian, an anarchist, or even a non-libertarian. I think there's always a good value in trying to address and say, all right, what are your concerns? Because I think ultimately at the end of the day, what everybody does is they come up with an idea that they believe is going to meet the concern that they have, right? And somebody's going to be right, somebody's going to be wrong. That just boils down to it. Or maybe somebody will be more right, like the negative consequences will be less, but still present, and others might have dramatic negative consequences, right? So even if it's not a cut and dry right, wrong, there's going to be some sliding scale where most people are going to find something better or worse. And so I think it's always a value add to meet somebody and say, what is it what concern are you trying to resolve in the first place? Because there's a good chance that we probably agree on that, right? Like, and like when it comes to people like Dave Smith, and I know we're using him as an example. I've done it many times on my own podcast just because he is a popular figure. One of the things that I think that libertarians tend to get caught up in is trying to insist that he be the good libertarian in all things. And so for me, I look at it and I say, there are areas for which I disagree with him on. Political strategy is almost always one. Whenever we're talking political strategy, you can almost always guarantee that Dave and I will disagree, and that's fine. And I'm okay with that, right? And I'm also okay with the fact that I disagree with him on immigration, right? On deportations. He's for mass deportation, or at least he was, maybe still is, but not in the way that it's going to turn out, because he didn't like the serious consequences that we already saw for just the little gain, if you will. Um, but I think he does very good when it comes to international policy, like international relations, and he's been very good on holding the line on being anti-war. And so for me, I just kind of I'm like, all right, well, yeah, I don't like some of his ideas here. I'm gonna let them go because I have one of two choices. I can go and I can try to communicate a better immigration policy to somebody, or I can try to convince Dave that he's wrong. And the truth of the matter is, convincing somebody else who's more at my level, meaning in terms of like it's hard to get access to Dave, so I don't have a lot of access to him in the first place, but I have access to other people around me. So I just try to focus on that. And then when he says good stuff about foreign policy, then I say, go check out my man Dave over here. He's saying some really good stuff about foreign policy. And I just I don't recommend his immigration stuff to people. you know, yeah, I recommend my own because I'm like, I think I've got a better idea. So all that being said, I don't want us to lose sight of our time and everything. When it comes to the Nations of Sanity project here, and we haven't really even discussed the non-aggression principle as far as where it plays a role in this entity that you're building. Tell me more about that, and then tell me where I might fit in, or what role that I might play in promoting it, helping sharpen your sword, whatever the case may be. Because I'm very curious about that. I think we've kind of discussed enough of your strategy, leading with principle, my strategy, leading with pragmatism. We get it. Both of us get it. I don't think we need to hammer on that anymore. So tell me more about the Nation of Sanity and the non-aggression, how those interact, and then what you're hoping I can be a value add to that.
Well, I mean, this conversation is one of the values that you can and have added. And I don't want to be presumptuous because I know we need to wrap up this conversation soon. But I'd be very keen to speak to you again because I feel that each conversation serves as a good foundation for the next. And
Sure.
And like you say, there's things we haven't even touched on yet. But probably the kind of I mean, just to use Dave one more time, as we've spoken about him so much, but kind of do the same for me that I want to do for Dave, whether he's interested or not, which is I want to correct him where he's wrong. And I want to support him where he's right. Like I'm the same as you. Like I very much agree with him on foreign policy, and I feel he does heroic work on that stage. And I will happily share him or defend him in the comment section if someone's calling him like a anti-Semitic or some nonsense or whatever. But then I will also criticize him over the immigration thing. I try to do it in a way that invites, I'm not, calling him anything or anything like that. But, I stick to the arguments. And I do think that we as a libertarian movement need to try to focus on like policy over personality, principle over personality, and like you say, take the good and accept the good. And so I support that and do that's so basically, cut a long story short, that's what I'd like you to do for me with the Nations of Sanity project. What you agree with, support in any way you can, whether it's sharing the idea to other people, or a particular issue. Oh, I think this project represents something that's worth considering for this issue or whatever, whatever that may be. And areas where you disagree or are simply unsure, come at me with those, you know what I mean? Like I say, that's what the reason I do that or try to do that for Dave, who I'm a nobody, he's a big famous person, so
sure.
but
I feel you.
I treat people how I want to be treated, you know what I mean? It's like the golden rule. I'm not a Christian, but I feel like the golden rule is a lovely principle that sits lovely and nicely on top of the non-aggression principle, actually, as a kind of slightly higher standard that that doesn't violate that. But with that kind of ethos of treating people, I'm treating Dave how I would want to be treated in his position, by honestly supporting the areas where I think he's correct and praising him for that and giving credit where it's due, and then criticizing him, not in a nasty way, but in a constructive way where I think he's incorrect, in the hope of correcting him and moving him. And also with the humility that I may be wrong on any of these things and I could be corrected. That's the purpose of this dialogue. It's easier said than done to put our egos aside, but the more we can do that, the better we move forward, together. I feel like the movement as a whole needs to adopt this attitude, and that's the kind of ethos with that kind of other project idea I have of trying to bring, libertarians together with this kind of ethos of let's help each other where we agree and disagree.
Right.
But really, with regards to the Nations of Sanity project, because this is a very specific idea, I want people to really pick at it, scrutinize it where you're unsure or where you disagree, where you think, well, I don't really agree with that, or I don't think that would work, or I'm not sure how this would work, or all of that's great. It helps me immensely. And if you agree with it or any part of it, then obviously support that in any which way you can. But probably the best thing people can do for me, and certainly someone like yourself can do, is having conversations like this. Because the more you come at me with questions, objections, and all the rest of it, the more I can either sharpen up the idea itself or sharpen up my messaging of it. Now, I'm obviously at a point where I feel like the idea has been pretty well sharpened up already. And obviously, if I felt like it needed more sharpened up, I would have done that already. But I'm open to the idea that that was true 3 years ago when I still did some sharpening.
Sure.
But even if I don't feel like the idea needs altering or changing in any way, my presentation of it certainly does. I'm a nobody, and one of the reasons why I kind of lead with the kind of idea and the project is because I don't think we'll ever have a free society based on people listening to me, but we could have a free society based on people coming together over an idea. And the way we can come together is to scrutinize it where we disagree, and like I say, and help shape it into a kind of idea that's had all of the kind of challenges and everything. And what's left, what you're left with is kind of something that's shaped that might actually kind of unite the world, as much as that sounds like a bit too much of a kumbaya kind of sentiment.
Right.
But as much as there's reasons to be feel hopeless, and there's plenty of things against us, one of the things that does give me hope is when I speak to even normies, there is actually more receptiveness to this kind of idea. We just need to break through a lot of misconceptions. We need to improve our messaging in ways that you yourself have mentioned. We do need to make sure the pragmatic arguments are being heard with the principle, I still think, but I definitely take point the point you made with regards to the importance of those pragmatic things, because, and again, to use the example of Dave, if I just led with a principle argument, even if I succeed in my goal, all I've done is made him decide to not be a libertarian anymore. Whereas if I follow that with a pragmatic argument as well and convince him of both, now he's a libertarian champion for the right side of the immigration policy, so and that's, I feel like, the approach. So I think there's a lot in what we've said where we're kind of on the same page, and even if we're coming at things from a slightly different perspective. And the best way you can help me with my Nations of Sanity project is offering me those other perspectives.
Sure.
It's like extra brain power, extra CPU if we were computers. It's like I can only challenge this so much in my own mind, I can only mold it so much in my own mind, and as a relatively unknown nobody, there's only so much I can do to spread it to other people. So everybody else I encounter, the scrutiny I welcome, the support I welcome, both are almost equally valuable for the work I'm doing.
Sure. Sounds good. Yeah, absolutely. I'll have to check out some of your stuff. Do you not stream then? Do you just only do video on demand?
Yeah, personally, I'm not super tech savvy, and I've never done a stream before, and I don't really have enough of an audience to justify looking into it. I mean, it's not something I would not do. I mean, I might do it if I had, the thing is like if I streamed, there's likely would be no one listening. You know what I mean? I don't really have that kind of an audience.
It can be challenging.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's why it was nice to be on Jacob's stream, because I know he's not a super massive channel, but he has enough of an audience that you'll get a couple of people listening live. So you're going to get, there were a couple of questions filtered through, and that's the good thing about the purpose of a stream is that you can have a few bit of live interaction from people that post questions and comments.
Right.
Because I don't think I'd get that anyway. I just don't see the value in looking into it. But maybe if things get a bit bigger, I'd go, look into streams.
Sure. No, I was
just
like
curious. Being on other people's streams, but
some people, that's their thing, because they just like, look, I want to edit it, and sometimes I'm talking and I stray a little bit, and I want to cut that part out so that people get just the meat. So other people like me, they're like, well, you get a lot of garbage in there too sometimes.
Yeah, no, I mean, I do upload them pretty raw because it's a whole thing to process it. So yeah, this will just go up as it is.
Gotcha.
But yeah, no, it's really just a case of I've never done a stream before, never looked into it. because I've never really had the audience to justify it.
I got you. I mean, it
yeah,
looks like you got some pretty decent views on some of your stuff. So, kudos on that.
yeah, I
Something.
mean, I had a conversation with David Friedman that had like over 1,000 views, and I've had
Oh,
a
yeah.
few videos that have got up into the kind of 500 mark.
Hmm.
But I think they seem to get the views later down the line after I've shared it
Yeah,
about and stuff.
that's how mine are, but I think that you're getting, because I'm seeing a lot of like close to 100. That seems to be pretty common, 70 to 90, 60 to 90, somewhere around there. Um, and that's more than what some of mine get, and I stream daily. So,
Okay,
it's a tough world out there. It really is.
it is. It
And
is.
it looks like you get some pretty good profile guests on here. So you got Walter Block, and then let's see. I thought I saw somebody else here that I was like,
Stefan
oh,
Kinsella, I've spoke
oh,
to.
did you?
Yeah, I've
He's
had
a
a,
he's a bit of a challenge for me because uh he's very sharp,
he can be quite
like in
prickly sometimes.
yeah, in the way that he addresses people. I've had to like I've seen some of his posts and I'm just want to fire back because I just don't like the attitude.
Yeah, I know.
And then I'm
I
like,
know. I
nah, don't
mean,
do that.
I like Stefan, and he's been really helpful. Like when he's very he's a bit of a paradox because though he can be quite sharp and prickly with people sometimes, and even I've seen some posts where I'm like, I don't think you needed to be quite like that with them. You know what I mean? But
Right.
then there's other times where he'll sit down and be really patient in explaining a principle. I think like if he feels like the person genuinely wants to learn, he
Hmm.
has the patience to explain. But I think. And to be honest, I can understand it because I think he's got a bit of Twitter fatigue where I think perhaps he's encountered a few too many people who aren't so perhaps a bit
Yeah.
disingenuous that he ends up perhaps treating other people in ways that
Yeah.
were colored by his experience with somebody else. But no, I've had a few conversations with him on my channel, but also on his channel as well. And he's been very useful because he's kind of helped. He's very good at getting into the principles of things. So when I've been kind
Mhm.
of and obviously because as I say I lead with the principle, and it's been very helpful for me. Just to give you a very quick example, I know we need to wrap
Mhm.
up, but one of the things I kind of learned was I understood that property rights come from self-ownership, but I always basically said, well, it comes from creation of voluntary trade. You build a house, you own the house. And I
Mhm.
remember one time Stefan corrected me on that. And he said, well, actually, it comes from first use principles. The creation and the voluntary trade comes afterwards, but your ownership comes from your first. Like if you didn't own the materials you built the house with, then you don't own the house. Where did you get the materials from? And that, even though it seems like a small point, it was
Mhm.
actually really important because it helps me draw a more definitive, direct line back to self ownership. And it helps me
Right.
understand property rights in a more fundamental way that helped guide how I judged all these different things with regards to, like, for example, like when you understand that it's based on first use principle, you can just imagine a scenario if you want to simplify the logic real, like you two people are walking through the woods. Say I come across some apple tree that's a
Mhm.
wild apple tree. I have those just as much right to pick an apple from that tree as you do. If I pick an apple, I didn't aggress against anybody. And you could go
Right.
pick an apple and you wouldn't aggress. But if you tried to take the apple that I'd already picked, that
Mhm.
would involve aggressing against me.
Right.
And it's as simple as that. It sounds almost childlike, but in a way, I think, and this is another thing I feel like we miss a trick a little bit as libertarians when we're projecting this message, is I think like we miss a trick because the simplicity of what we represent is one of its biggest strengths. And I feel like sometimes we let too much noise kind of get in the way of what is a very crisp message. A little bit like some of the examples. And I know we've got to wrap up, so I don't want to get all into
Sure. Sure. You're good.
but but like some of the examples you gave, it's like, well, a lot of those things would be solved if we just cut through the thing of, okay, well, where does your rights end? You know what I mean? Like,
Mhm.
because the conversation of what's a good idea is a different conversation with regards to your rights. If I'm not sure I agree with how someone's parenting their child, well, they have a higher right to decide that. And unless it's some kind of black and white child abuse where I feel justified to step in, I know that it's essentially, from a rights point of view, none of my business. That doesn't mean I can't have an opinion. That doesn't mean I can't find peaceful ways to, encourage a different way of parenting. But the fact of the matter is if I don't have that beyond a reasonable doubt certainty that they are violating the non-aggression principle, then any force I use to say take their kid from them would itself be a violation of the non-aggression principle.
Right.
You know what I mean? So, and it's just there's lots of little things like that. I say that's something that Stephan Gazelle has been very helpful with, helping me kind of clarify my understanding of the principles. And that's just one final thing, one final point. That's why my parting message to you would be, even though I fully accept your points about the importance of the pragmatic arguments, I would implore you to include the principled argument, because I do feel that it creates this mesh that holds these issues together and adds a kind of clarity that helps people understand. It is important for someone to understand why behind things. You know, I know it might seem more important that they do the right thing, but that right thing is more stable if they're doing it for the right reason. You know what I mean? I don't want to look a good gift horse in the mouth. I'm not going to turn away positive steps, even if they're not perfect. But that's why I think the principle is important. So that's the only thing I would say to you as a kind of final kind of message. I take on board what you said about the pragmatic side, and I do follow up my principle with the pragmatic arguments, understanding the importance of it. And all I would say is perhaps the converse to you is, yeah, keep your pragmatic approach, but perhaps bring the principle in too, because that's also important, and it has pragmatic value as well as value. So anyway, I think we should probably finish up, because I've gone well over the time that we said that we would
that's
do.
okay.
I really appreciate, like I say, sincerely appreciate you taking the time to have this conversation. I would love to have another conversation with you in the future. I don't want to be too presumptuous over your time, but I feel like there's more to discuss if you'd be up for it. Just perhaps just to finish the video off, if you want to just sort of tell people where they can find you. I will put links in the description for your channel, but just if you want to just sort of give a little plug to yourself to anyone listening.
Sure, absolutely. So the best way to find me, you can just go to youtube.libertydad.com. That's going to be, you can also go to libertydad.com. That's just going to be the host for the podcast that I have. But if you want to find my visual stuff, youtube.libertydad.com. You can find me elsewhere, X, Facebook, stuff like that. But honestly, if you're just looking for my content, I would go with YouTube. That's going to be the easiest way. Facebook, the messages kind of filter down, and then eventually it's harder to find the videos and stuff like that. Same thing for X. Actually, X is even worse. I have a Rumble. You could actually go to rumble.libertydad.com, but I don't really focus on it so much. So I'm going to be more active either on X through texting, or not texting, but, through written word, and then through video on youtube.libertydad.com. So find me there.
Great. Well, I'll put links in the description so people don't have to work as hard as actually typing it out themselves and searching down a terrible algorithm. So I'll put the links now. I recommend people check it out. There's a lot of great videos on there. And I just want to say thank you for everyone listening, and thank you, DL, for taking the time to have this conversation.
Absolutely.